Kevin Jordan says, when I was in school, they sent us outside for an hour at a time, rain, freeze, or shine, to vent our energy, clamber over rusty, jagged steel, jump out of trees, and learn modern social skills, and now people can't eat gluten. Your thoughts? Well, needless to say, I agree with the sentiment about getting kids out there, and I also think that it's bigger than just the physical, I almost said intimidation, but timidization of people. Why don't we go to a different shot for this one? Here's what I think on this particular issue. Yes, I completely agree with you. Not sending kids outdoors to play is bad for kids. It's bad for their physical condition. There's no question it's bad for their physical health. That's the start. Where can you go from there? Because I think it's much bigger than that. It's bad for their physical conditioning, and it's bad for their psychological conditioning because they're not facing threats. They're not dealing with danger of any kind. They're not in the environment. They're not in anything unstructured. They're not any of those things. They're just, kept in the little womb of the classroom. So there's the psychological aspect where as you stress people less and less and less, that doesn't make them more able to deal with stress. It makes them less able to deal with stress, needless to say. So you're not doing them any favors there. Third, you are setting up a psychological dependency. You're setting up a psychological weakness where they're just incapable of facing anything. They can't compete. They can't, and they never get hurt. They never know what it's like to recover from being hurt. They never bang themselves up. So it's like, hey man, what do you say? You cannot protect people forever. What's going to happen to these kids when their parents die? My brother has an extremely autistic child. That'd be my nephew. Very. And he said something that just broke my heart. I mean, he was talking about the amount of care that this kid needs. He's the sweetest kid, terrific kid, very talented young man now. But he said, we can never die. His mom and I can never die. We have to live forever because if we don't, who's going to take care of this kid? And we're doing that to everybody. They're being driven. They're 20 years old. They're 22, 23 years old. They're being driven everywhere by their moms. They're staying with their parents. They don't know how to do laundry. They don't know how to pay bills. They don't know how to shop for groceries. I mean, I came to that game fairly late, but by the time I got to college when I was 18 years old, it's like, where are my clean clothes? Well, you have to go wash them yourself. I have to what? There's nothing in the fridge. Well, that's because you haven't gone out and bought any groceries. I have to go buy groceries. Yes, you do. And by doing things like buying groceries and doing your laundry, traumatic, horrible events like this, you learn how to be an adult. You learn how to grow up. And when, if it's late at night and you don't feel like going to the 24-hour Skaggs Albertsons in Gainesville, Florida in 1980, then don't. When you wake up in the morning, you're going to be hungry. And then maybe you can go then. And this is how you learn lessons, I was thinking about this a little earlier today, actually, how so many of the lessons we learn are just lessons of pain. I mean, it's just that simple. This hurts, so don't do that. These are heuristics, by the way. And that's something that should do a whole show on, actually, this idea of heuristic thinking, the idea that heuristics, unless I misunderstand it completely, are a series of lessons that we learn. And we learn a lesson, and then we use that heuristically so that we don't have to relearn that lesson. We just take that as read, so to speak. For example, if something is glowing red, it's a red hot stove, you put your hand on it, burn your hand, it's like, ooh, that hurt. Now your amygdala says don't do that again, and you don't have to relearn that a red hot stove burns your hand. That's a heuristic lesson that you learned. So when you see that red hot stove, you don't touch it again. Now the beautiful thing about heuristics is you can then sort of interpolate from that experience, and then you can say, even though that's not my red hot stove, which I know is hot and hurts when I touch it, it is, however, something else that's red hot. Maybe I shouldn't touch that either. That's a heuristic lesson that you learn, and so on. And so all of our belief systems are based on these heuristic presumptions because we don't get to learn everything all over again all the time. So, as you get higher and higher up the scale of philosophy, you're making more and more and more assumptions. And this is where liberals and conservatives, I cannot call them liberals anymore. Leftists and conservatives, progressives and conservatives, is where we part company. We part company where our heuristic experiences begin to divide. Both progressives and conservatives, unless they're clinically insane, will agree that you shouldn't touch something that's red hot. That's a simple heuristic lesson that everybody learns, and most of us can agree on this. But as you start to get higher up in the hierarchy of things that you've learned from heuristics, then these positions can diverge because somebody is starting to count an untried premise as true. That's really what it comes down to, I think. They start to count, kind of an untested or undocumented premise as true. Now, sometimes they'll do that intentionally. Sometimes, whether consciously or subconsciously, they will basically say to themselves, well, this may not be true, but I'd like it to be true. It'd be nice if it were true. Sure would. But that don't make it so. And that puts you in a tough spot when you're trying to deal with the world as the world is. It'd be nice if it were true. It'd be nice if giving poor people money made them rich, but it doesn't. Poverty is a series of very bad decisions. It's not to say it's just bad decisions, but it's largely bad decisions. And when people win, multi-million-dollar lotteries, more often than not, they're stone cold broke and out of a job within 5-10 years, because they didn't learn the lessons that came with the increase in wealth. I know I've told this story before. I was driving a limousine one day back when I got out here in '88 or '89, somewhere in there, and there was a woman in the back seat, and we were driving through South Central, and she lived in San Marino, which is a very upscale neighborhood. South Central, not so much. And she didn't say a word on the whole trip, but she just looked out at this, all of this poverty and garbage everywhere, and iron bars on the windows, and she said, if we took all the people here and moved them into San Marino, and all the people who lived in San Marino moved them here, in a year, this place would look like San Marino, and San Marino would look like this place. Now, a lot of people say it's a very racist thing or a very classist thing to say, but it's really not. Not when you get right down to it. And certainly it doesn't need to be. What she's basically saying is that the people in South Central were performing behaviors and had a certain skill set and a certain attitude that resulted in their neighborhood looking like this, and likewise the people in San Marino had skills and habits and behaviors that had their neighborhood looking as it is. So if you imagine the two switching, it kind of makes sense, right? If you forced people from an upscale neighborhood like San Marino into South Central Los Angeles, the first thing they'd do is start cleaning up. That's the first thing they would do, is they'd start cleaning house. They'd start cleaning the inside of the house. They'd start cleaning the outside of the house. The houses would be smaller, and they would do the best they could to make them as livable as possible. If you put those people in menial jobs, they would do those menial jobs as well as they could and start looking for promotions, start figuring out ways to maybe subcontract out their menial jobs. They'd start using the habits and the skill sets they have to improve their lives in their neighborhoods. And likewise, people without those skill sets and habits would be given mansions and luxurious yards, and we've seen this happen all the time. All you have to do is look at these housing projects. It's got nothing to do with black or white. It's got nothing to do with your ethnicity or your race or anything. It's just what happens when you have the skill sets of poverty versus the skill sets of affluence. It's not the wealth fairy, There's not some wealth fairy that comes and dings certain people in their sleep and says, congratulations, you're rich and you're going to be poor. Too bad for you. Tough break. It's about decisions and habits and skills and modes of behavior. And so what you find is that people who generally live in poverty have very poor ability to plan for the future. They're often living in such... Now listen, I'm not trying to make this a moral failure exclusively or even primarily. I know what it's like to live hand to mouth. And when you live hand to mouth, you have very little opportunity to expand yourself. You're usually working so hard just in the treadmill just to keep body and soul together. It's very hard to get ahead and get out of that. But it can be done, and here I am. I mean, So I want to be crystal clear on this point, on how we got off this tangent, but I think it's rich territory. I'm not saying, I want to be really clear on this. I'm not saying that if you swap the people from San Marino and South Central, that the people in South Central, that the ability to enrich yourself is something that they have the means of doing, and they just don't because they're lazy. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that poor people are poor because, geez, all they have to do is just buckle down and they'd be able to get right out of there. That is true, but it's also true that they have absolutely no ability to do it. And to claim that they do is just not true. So poor people are not poor because they choose to be poor, but they are making choices that make them poor. Isn't that a weird sort of a thing? That's really kind of it. They're not choosing to be poor, but they're making choices that make them poor. And they don't know any better. They've never seen it, and they have nothing to compare it to, and they have nothing to reference it against. I'll say two more things about this. Usually when you go into really bad neighborhoods, it's the drug dealers who are simultaneously the biggest problem and also on some level the best hope. Look, if I was stuck in a neighborhood and I had no way out of there, chances are I'd be dealing drugs too. I'd do it as smart as I could. What would you do? I mean, drug dealing is an entrepreneurial operation. They're businessmen. They're brutal businessmen. They're in a brutal environment, and it's a brutal business. On some level, the drug dealers are the smartest people in the ghettos, and on some level, they're the ones who should be the most heavily recruited to turn things around. The actual damage is done by the addicts who are so desperate for this hit, and it's not just a psychological hit. I mean, I've read a couple of really remarkable books lately, and one of them was called The Coroner by David Simon, who's a big old liberal. That's okay with me. He wrote Homicide, A Year on the Killing Streets, which was a year with the Baltimore Police Department. Then he wrote a book called The Coroner, which was about a year in the drug culture in Baltimore. And his point was there's a corner everywhere, that every town in America has a corner where you can go buy drugs. And he was talking about the fact that prior to the 80s, you had heroin junkies. And a heroin junkie was a guy who would, get his boost and then he'd just be out for the day. I mean, be gone for the day or 2 days. He said when crack cocaine came along, you would find people who would come back and hit the same dealer 3, 4, 5 times an hour. And that the physical dependency on that high, the actual physical addiction was so overwhelming that you become a dope fiend. And it's easy to look at people who are dope fiends and say, well, just pull yourself together, man. But I've been in rooms full of dope fiends for a long time. And it's not that easy. It's some cases the chemical addiction is so strong that it's simply overpowering. And if you've never been in a situation like that, then I am extremely happy to hear it, and you should be very grateful, because there are things that are overpowering. They'll make you lose your family, make you lose your self-respect, your pride, your job, your car, your house, your everything. You will lose it all if something becomes that powerful over you. And for many, many, many people, this is that. So, these are complex issues. But I think the way to solve them primarily, if somebody said to me, Bill, we really want to do something, real, about the drug epidemic and the crime epidemic and the violence epidemic, what I would do is I would take the people, if I had dictatorial powers, and I don't want dictatorial powers, but if you wanted to really solve it, I think the thing to do would be to take these worst ghettos and disperse them into the larger population. Now, some people had a problem with what I said about the drug dealers being the smartest people. They're certainly the most evil, and I'm not trying to claim that they're not. They are the most evil. They are the ones who are consciously ruining lives in order to make a buck. Got it. But those are also the smartest people. And so, anyway, I actually kind of want to stay here for a minute, because I've been thinking these thoughts for quite a while. A lot of times getting them out is important. I haven't had a chance to really say them aloud. It's easy to look at the crime and the addiction in these inner cities as a sort of a failure of many things, and it is. It's a failure of family. It's a failure of religion. It's a failure of all of these things. And what it really is, not exclusively, but a lot of it is a failure of economic opportunities. Again, not exclusively. One of the key story in the corner is a true story of a guy named Gary McCullough, who was, by all accounts, a really bright young black man, and went to Ohio State, was going to be an engineer, superbly bright, very well educated, extremely well-read man, good man too, whose father basically worked his way into Baltimore from a farm, where he was essentially working on a plantation in either North Carolina or South Carolina. Took his family to Baltimore, raised 15 kids in Baltimore, never broke the law a day in his life, talked about how the neighborhoods in Baltimore used to be when he arrived in 1955, how black and white people maybe didn't live like cheek and jowl, but certainly got along, and everybody was friendly, and there was not a whole lot of crime because most people had good jobs. And then the destruction of our inner cities, really, I didn't really understand this until I got to this book. Now, somebody's just say that's the way progressives think. Well, I'm telling you, I've been in Narcotics Anonymous for a year, so I don't know if you have or not, but I have, and I'm telling you that there are certain things that are beyond your ability to control, at least on your own, and that there is an awful lot of power in these addictions, an awful lot. And that while we can look at some of these things and say, well, I just would do this, 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 and this, that's lovely, but the fact of the matter is we know how to do these things, and they don't. That doesn't mean there's not a moral decision on some level and a responsibility. I'm not saying they're not responsible, but I am saying it's not as easy as it looks. In any event, what this guy's point was, and I think it's a really good point, is that basically what happened, and I hadn't put these things together clearly enough, but without question, America's turned to a third wave information age economy. And there's nothing that you can do to stop that. It's as inevitable as anything else. There was a great deal of resistance to the Industrial Revolution with the Luddites. They just wanted to have the farm life, and the idea of all these factories and machines was terribly intimidating to them. But there's nothing you can do about it. This is bigger than empires. It's bigger than nations. It's gigantic, enormous cultural forces at work. And so the world changed when the industrial era happened, and then the world changed again when the information age happened. And as the information age swept through America, like it or not, we began to make enough money in the information age that we could afford to buy things, and those things could be manufactured more cheaply overseas because the labor costs were so much lower. And we started buying those things, and we stopped manufacturing things in this country for very, very enormous reasons. People will buy a $29 drill over an $89 drill, and I don't blame them. In any event, what's basically happened is this expanding conversion from the industrial era to the information era washed across the country, and the place it didn't penetrate were mostly the inner cities, because people of limited education background and limited intelligence background, and not to denigrate anybody who works on an assembly line, because I have enormous respect for the hard work that entails. I have 7 generations of people in my family who are cotton carders in textile mills, so you're not going to get any kind of elitist snobbery out of me on this one. But it is easier to teach somebody to perform a skill on an assembly line than it is to teach them how to run a computer, be a graphics designer, or be an account manager for an insurance company. And I want to come to this point that somebody else just made here in a second. So this economic change blew past these cities and left people who would formerly have decent jobs and decent pay as industrial workers with nothing to do and no way to get there. And as the education system is run by Democrats and progressives, and it's just one giant pay scheme, all the money that was left was going into the government. No one had any private sector jobs, and the schools got worse and the education got worse. The chance of getting a job got lower. So you turn to crime and you turn to drugs. There's your chance of getting a job even lower. And it's this death spiral, and somebody has to break it up. Somebody has to stop it or be prepared for the consequences. Now, what we're see going on in the comment stream was somebody was saying that progressives think that the answer is to put poor people out with rich people, and then he went on to say that they want to do this by law. Now, I'm not disagreeing with any of that. I'm against coercion in every form. I don't think you should be doing it by law, but if you wanted to solve the problem, I wouldn't put poor people next to rich people as a way of punishing them or as a way of punishing the rich or as a way of ginning up the poor people. I would do what I saw the Mormons do, basically. When I went to Salt Lake City back in 2009 or 10, I got a tour of Welfare Square, which is their sort of their public works thing. And it's spotlessly clean. You could eat off the floor. They're canning food. They're storing food. They're shipping food all around the world without getting any credit. They're just all this hate directed their way. But basically what they do is when somebody is indigent, they don't give them a check. They give them a job, and they give them a job in the factory, and they take home a paycheck, which is nice. So they have the self-respect that comes with a job. So they're working from the beginning, and they're earning their money, which means that since they earned it, it's theirs, and it means that they don't have to have resentment, like, where's the rest of my money? So there's that aspect. But the other things, that, unless I missed my understanding, that the Mormons do is the Mormons put these people in with other families. They don't force them, and they don't bust them into their neighborhood so much as they sponsor them, as you might sponsor somebody in an AA or an NA meeting. And so what happens then is that these people with these very poor habits, very poor skill sets, are surrounded by people who know how to do things like cook rice and chicken. So instead of spending $5 on a McDonald's hamburger, $5 buys a lot of rice and chicken. It's much better for you. Most people don't know how to do it. They've never had to do it. They don't have pots and pans, so they help them with these things. And then all of a sudden, over the course of years, the skills of the healthy community are imparted into the people that didn't have the skills through osmosis and imitation and support. And there's nothing coercive about that. I don't want to be misunderstood about this. I don't think we should just be busing people into rich neighborhoods just to make things worse. I'm saying if you want to solve this problem, you really have to start thinking about adopting a poor family voluntarily and teaching them how not to be poor, teaching them how to do things like plan ahead, set aside some money, teaching them about things like education and why that's important, and teach people how to be interested in things. And by the way, a big part of this, if you wanted to get really serious about it, a big part of this would be triage. This is the way you have to do anything of any magnitude. When you're faced with a catastrophe of the magnitude that we're facing socially as a result of these progressive policies of just giving people stuff, bribing them to not riot, basically. If you really, really, really wanted to fix this problem, you could do it, but you'd have to start with a very, very clean slate. And one of the things that you'd have to do is triage. When you have a problem that is so large that you do not have the resources to tackle all of it, you have to do some form of triage, and this is what we'd have to do as well. So triage in this case would be what triage would be in a case of a medical catastrophe. If we've got a hospital with 50 beds in it, and we've got 1,000 badly injured people, 1,000 injured people show up at the door. Triage is pretty simple, really, when you get right down to it. Triage says, okay, you are so lightly injured that you're not about to die. I know it hurts. If we have an aspirin, we'll give you an aspirin, put a bandage on this guy's hand, keep him in the emergency room. He may be in that emergency room for hours or days, but he's not going to die. So the people who are not terribly badly injured don't get treated right away because we have limited treatment ability. Triage also says that there are some people who will die whether they get treatment or not. These people are mortally wounded. They're fatally damaged. And therefore, spending resources on them is a waste of resources, because if we can't save them, then the resources that we're going to deploy on these people and have them die anyway could be used to save people's lives. So triage means three parts, right? So the first part is the people who are so lightly wounded that they don't need immediate critical care can go sit over there and wait. Another group of people who are so badly injured that all the care in the world isn't going to save them can go over there and die in comfort if we can pull it off, if we can give them some morphine or something. And that means that the limited resources that we have are applied to where they'll do the most good. People whose lives could be saved with the treatment. And if you want to look at the situation in terms of society right now, then triage is where we need to be. I mean, if you really want to look at it with the brass tacks, conservative, clear-eyed vision of what the world is today, I would have to say that if we were to go at these problems of poverty and drug addiction, and they're closely related problems, you're talking about a generational effort. It's something that's going to take 25 or 30 years to pull off. And the first thing you have to do is you have to do triage. That means that there are people out there right now in our inner cities who are violent, vicious, murdering psychopaths. There's plenty of good reasons maybe for why they became that way, but that's not within our power to go back and fix. These people need to be treated in the harshest possible terms. They need to be incarcerated for the rest of their lives, and if there's a treatment program that we can afford in a prison that can turn around 2, 3, 4, 5, 10% of those people, that's a win. But generally speaking, there are psychopathic murderers on the streets of this country. And those people need to be locked up and put away forever so they can't hurt anybody else. Likewise, out there are people who need just a little bit of help, maybe just need a little stimulus. Maybe you're going to make it harder for them to get their benefits. When we did the welfare reform in the 90s, we found that by making it harder to get welfare, significant percentage of the total welfare roll just didn't show up. They just didn't come to collect their checks because now I have to prove I'm going looking for a job. Forget it. So they didn't really need the money that badly in the first place. So that kind of triage on the lightly wounded end. So the heavily wounded people, the psychopaths, they got to be locked up. The people who need a little stimulus, a little cattle prod, kind of a little shock to get to work, great, let's do that. And smack dab in the middle are the people who we need to dedicate resources to, and those resources need to be directed to teaching them the skills of being not rich necessarily, but at least middle class. One of the things I read about this subject was so shocking and so disturbing. I read, a couple years ago. I read it online, of course, so I have no way to track it back. But there was a guy in San Francisco, basically just a rich progressive, not rich, but self-sufficient. And he wanted to find out what poverty was like. And you got to give him credit for guts. So this guy, who was basically middle class or maybe even upper middle class, kind of a liberal intellectual, just went off the grid. And he started living in public housing in San Francisco. He started living among the poorest, most violent Americans. And he had enough credibility and maybe enough of the right attitude so that he wasn't, killed immediately. And he started to get to know these people and be accepted by people. And as I was reading his essays, the thing that struck me so strongly, and the thing that struck him so strongly, was just how poor people are at making decisions, just how very little follow-through there is. For example, he said somebody found a newish couch or something on the side of the road or something, and they brought the new couch up to the apartment, took the old couch out into this narrow little apartment corridor, and left it outside their door on the 4th floor or something like this. And for a year, people had to walk over this couch because nobody had the vision or the effort or the cooperation or anything to carry the damn thing down and put it out in the garbage. So people just climbed over this couch and you're carrying bags of groceries and you're stepping over this couch because no one had the ability, the habits or the standards to get the old garbage out of the way. And so if the building catches fire, then people are going to die, and nobody did it. And it's one of the things that you really want to get down to brass tacks now. You really, 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 really want to get to brass tacks. Where you really have to go with this ultimately is you have to look at the one-to-one correlation between poverty, crime, and IQ. The correlation is astonishingly high. It's astonishingly high. So, you are mostly dealing. One of the reasons people become criminals is because they do not have the ability. Forget the habit. They don't have the ability to think in the future. When you interview career criminals, lower level street criminals, what you find is that somebody will do something, or steal something, and said, "Well, didn't you know there was a surveillance camera there?" "Yeah, but I wanted the Xbox." "But you knew there was a surveillance camera there, right? And that somebody was watching." "Yeah, but I wanted the Xbox." "But you'd already been arrested so that it'd be possible to match your picture with something," and they can't connect the two. They can't foresee it, which is why so many criminals are extremely low IQ people. Somebody was talking about this with somebody once, and somebody said, "And by the way, this idea of the master criminal, the mastermind criminal, is fiction. Doesn't exist. It's an Arthur Conan Doyle invention, Professor Moriarty. Because if Moriarty were really that smart, he'd be making a lot of money in business." So, I don't know where we got off on this track, but it's a good track to be off on. It's a very serious issue, but you have to, if you're serious about it, you have to be serious. You have to speak openly and honestly and truthfully. So, what do? You can't do much about IQ. IQ is actual genuine IQ now is largely inherited and inheritable and is essentially, it's like height, right? I mean, you can't make short people taller. And height, like IQ, is a standard, is a bell curve distribution. There's very few very, very short people. There's very few very, very tall people. And in the middle are people of more or less average height and so on. It's the same thing with IQ. IQ breaks out the same way. So what you can do, though, while you can't really do much about IQ, you can do an awful, awful, awful lot about behavior. And take Baltimore, for example. In 1955, there's certainly no big genetic drift in IQ between Baltimore in the 1970s and Baltimore in the 2010s. I mean, the ethnic mix was more or less the same, and everything was more or less the same. But in Baltimore in the 1970s, Baltimore may have been a little economically depressed, but it wasn't the war zone that we see today. The reason it's become the war zone we see today is because of addiction through things like crack, but that's also as a result of a lack of jobs, and it's a result of habits. It's a result of bad habits. So, these are the things that have to be addressed. And, well, look, they don't have to be addressed. We can leave them alone if we want to. I'd like to solve the crime problem because I don't like crime. I'd like to solve the crime and the welfare problem because 2/3 of every dollar I send in our taxes are going to somebody else. We could run the government on, 60% of the total revenues that we spend are on entitlements. So I'd like to stop this for my own personal self-interest. I'd like to stop it because they are people, and people shouldn't have to live that way. And I'm not all about these big social engineering programs. On the contrary, the reason we're in this kind of trouble is because of these big social engineering problems. I do think, however, that when you get right down to the root cause of poverty and crime, they are the results of behaviors that are almost default behaviors of the human condition. Somebody, happy coincidence, just put up the Robert Heinlein quote, M2 Foster put up, "Poverty is the normal condition of man." It is. So I don't mean to suggest that the decisions that make you poor or are learned. It's the decisions that make you rich that are learned. Poverty is the default state of people. All you have to do is go to the third world and see this a village with a sewer in the middle of it, and it's a reason that sewer's running through the middle of the village and not underground in a pipe is because the sewer's always been in the middle of the village. It's the default condition of people. And that's what I see happening in America right now. It's why I'm conservative, because things are running down. Things aren't getting better, they're getting worse. Look at the Academy Awards. These clowns are not the same kind of things that were there 30, 40 years ago. You ever see the recent Comedy Central roasts compared to the Dean Martin roasts? The people are no-name people throwing insults at people they've never met to other people with no talent. Boom. Things are running down. Things are getting worse. The cities are getting worse. And if you looked at at Baltimore, if you saw if you're really interested, and I can't recommend this highly enough, by the way, just go to YouTube and search for The Coroner, which is the 6-part HBO series that David Simon's book was made into. It was done in the year 2000. And it's got French subtitles, but it's free, and it's all there. One of the things that's so effective about the dramatization of The Coroner is that there are frequent flashbacks to what Baltimore used to be like in 1955 and in 1970, even 1980 and 1990, and it wasn't what it is today. When you see the flashbacks of Baltimore in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and then you cut to what Baltimore was like even in the year 2000, it looks like The Walking Dead. It looks like some sort of virus or bomb or radiation or an asteroid struck or some disease happened or there was a solar flare. You look at what American cities have become, they look like this post-apocalyptic dystopia that you see in Mad Max. And it wasn't always this way. And there wasn't a nuclear war, and there wasn't a plague of locusts, and there wasn't a solar flare or an asteroid impact, and there wasn't a virus that killed, 90% of the population. What happened was the economy changed and democratic policies kept pumping minimum amounts of food pellets into these neighborhoods, and when you've got nothing but despair, drugs are a lovely way to escape. I imagine they're a lovely way to escape. I don't imagine it's very lovely at all. In fact, I bet it's a miserable way to escape. Come to think of it, it's just all there is. Right? So no one's talking about these issues on this level. No one is talking about these issues on this level. And I would say there's nothing contradictory about any of this. If I were to try to solve these issues, or at least improve them, because you'll never solve them, but if you could improve them, I would use all of my conservative principles, and I wouldn't violate any one of them. I would basically ask people in the country to volunteer to adopt and adapt. Perfect. Adopt and adapt a poor family. And that's going to require some responsibility, because some of these people are going to have very, very poor choices. And some people are going to get burned by this, and some people may even get killed by it. But the generosity of the American people is overwhelming. And if you put the case to them that we can not only help ourselves as a nation and help these people as individuals, but we can awaken people and fill them with the kind of life that we experience, you'd find a fair amount of gratitude out there too, I tell you that. So, that would be the deal I would make to the American people as president. I would say, look, we are not going to tolerate what we've got right now. This is not a tolerable situation. It's not tolerable for those of us who are paying taxes to support it. It's not tolerable for those of us who are victims of crime to maintain it. And it's especially not tolerable to the, believe it or not, majority of people who have to live in these neighborhoods. So we're going to do something about it. And here's the deal. We're going to offer a voluntary escape route for those who want it. Voluntary. We're going to go to the American people and ask for their charity and some help in getting these people into environments and societies where people make decent decisions, where they can have some hope and some security and some safety and some support. And for those of them who don't want to take it, then you need to understand that we're not going to tolerate the crime anymore. And you just get serious about this. And if that means having to triple the number of prisons, then that's what we have to do. And turn them into schools after that cohort dies out. That's it, folks. But nobody's having this conversation. And there are a big part of this is how many people can we employ, because ultimately if they're not employable, then it's just a matter of which state of dependency are they on for the rest of their lives. The information age isn't going to go away. Some manufacturing, in fact, I bet you a lot of manufacturing could come back to America. It'd be a wonderful thing. It'd be a great thing for this country and for the people of this country to bring manufacturing back. But again, you cannot ask Americans or anyone else in the world to pick an $89 drill over a $29 drill in order to take one on the chin. It doesn't work that way. Shouldn't have to work that way. I've said before, China is taking, China and now all the rest of the countries too, because even China's getting expensive, taking all these manufacturing jobs because their labor costs are so low. You can't ask Americans to work for $4 a day. You can't live like that in this country. There's no way to go. So what you can do, though, is if a pair of shoes costs $100 and China can make them for $30 and sell them for $100 because they've got cheap labor, if we can use our incredible energy resources, then while our labor costs may be higher, we could still make a pair of $30 shoes because we can use lower energy costs to offset, partially offset, maybe even increasingly offset these things. Then we can start making things in this country again because we can make them competitive on the world market. And, I say let's give it a try, because it's not just the cost of labor. It's the cost of energy. It's the cost of resources, the cost of transportation. All these things are built into the cost of a pair of shoes or a pair of anything else. So, certainly if we made energy cheap and available, and it's under our feet, it's not like we are purposely blocking ourselves. We're putting shackles on our own legs. If we were to free up energy reserves in this country and make energy cheap, clean, and affordable, and I mean really affordable, really cheap, really clean, if you have virtually free energy, you have a thorium reactor underneath these factories, and they're smaller factories, not big industrial factories. I want to spread this thing out. I want to get these cities spread out. I want to spread the working force, the manufacturing force out into the population voluntarily. Here's a factory. We make things, and we give people jobs, and instead of employing 10,000 people, we employ 70 people or 100 people or 120. Boom, spread it out. You could probably get an awful lot of these problems solved. So there you go. Anyway, something to think about and something to discuss in the future. But how we got there and going outside, I don't know, Kevin, but you certainly got me going, so I appreciate that.